Bonjour, Tom Sager, watching, hello. You are listening to Indigenous Waves on CIUT 89.5 FM. Indigenous Waves is a celebration of Indigenous cultures, locally, nationally, and globally. Through music, storytelling, interviews, panel discussions, art, and humor, we explore the diversity of Indigenous peoples. My name is Susan Blight, that's Blighty Boo on Twitter, and I'm flying solo today without my co-host Kanosh, but he's here in spirit and he'll be back soon. So we'd love to hear your feedback, your song requests, and ideas, so please do connect with us on Facebook and at Indigenous Waves on Twitter. You can also email us at indigenouswaves@gmail.com. On today's show, we'll be talking with two guests about the ongoing issue of missing and murdered Aboriginal women. Tomorrow is Friday the 14th, the day of the annual march to honor the memory of and demand justice for the over 600 missing and murdered Aboriginal women. Today we have in the studio with us Jorge Antonio Vallejos. Jorge is a mixed-race poet, essayist, and journalist based in Toronto, and he's the founder of the blog blackcoffeepoet.com. That's a blog dedicated to showcasing Indigenous and anti-colonial poetry and literature. Hello, Jorge.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I just want to let you know we're having a little bit of trouble with your mic, so let's switch the mic over. Please bear with us, listeners. Okay, sorry about that. So thank you for being here, Jorge. Let's give a test on your mic.
Hello?
This is your second time on Indigenous Waves, is it not?
Yes, in less than a year, and I'm very honored to be here. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Also joining us by telephone is Jennifer Lord. Jennifer is Strategic Policy Liaison in the Evidence to Action Department at the Native Women's Association of Canada. That's an organization that works to preserve Aboriginal culture, achieve equal opportunity for Aboriginal women, and has a role in shaping legislation relevant to Aboriginal women. Jennifer holds an MA in International Affairs from Carleton University and a BA in History from the University of Ottawa. Hello, Jennifer.
Hi.
Hi, thanks so much for joining us in the studio.
Thank you for having me.
Or by telephone. I'm just going to switch my mic. Just give me 1 second, please, listeners. There we are. Sorry about that. So Jennifer, I might start with you if you don't mind. If you could just tell us what kind of work the Native Women's Association of Canada has done on this issue of missing and murdered Aboriginal women.
Well, the Native Women's Association of Canada has been aware of this issue for decades, really. I mean, it's been the families themselves who have, for years, been coming to the organization and letting us know that something is going on. Either they came as individuals and say, for example, a police officer didn't want to file a missing persons report, or they felt that they weren't accessing justice properly, so they were individual cases. But we also have larger groups of families coming to us, telling us that this was going on, and noticing trends and hotspots and things like that. So in 2004, the Native Women's Association of Canada went through a year-long lobbying effort with a lot of our partners, like Amnesty International Canada, for example, and we are pushing forward this need to give a non-government organization like NWAC funds to put research together, because it wasn't necessarily the families were being believed. Like we have this saying in a lot of our communities, what the people believe is true, and that wasn't necessarily being heard or believed at the government level. So we lobbied for a year, and we were very grateful to receive an initiative called Sisters in Spirit, which was for 5 years, from 2005 to 2010.
Mm-hmm. What can you tell our listeners about the Sisters in Spirit initiative?
Well, as I said, the initiative was 5 years long, and what we did was it was a research, policy, and education initiative. On the research section, we brought together as many families as we could, families that came forward who had either a missing or murdered loved one, and we had them share their stories with us. We also had them meet in annual gatherings, as many as our budget would allow, to have families come together, share their story, and really create a sense of community, because I think the families that we were meeting on the road and from coast to coast to coast are really telling us that they felt very much alone. So by bringing them together, we were allowed to really learn and benefit from their lived experience, right? The families of missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls in our country are really the people with the expertise to the lived experience, and we need to hear from them as much as possible, and then take all of what they have to say and bring it and bring it to government. And that's how we're kind of talking about this UN inquiry now, is that people are really starting to listen to this gathered information that we've put together.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I read about Sisters in Spirit was that it was about the database that was created. I'm wondering if you can just tell our listeners a little bit about the database and whether or not it's actually still operating.
Okay, so the database, like I said, it was a research, policy, and education initiative. So the research part of that was not only, like what do we do with the information that we collected from families, and that the families really gifted to us in terms of, sharing their voice and empowering them. We also had a dedicated research team at that point that started to put case files together for all these missing and murdered women and girls. So when we're talking about the numbers and what the statistics say, it's really important for us as an organization always to underscore the fact that every number represents a woman, that every statistic has a story behind it. And we started to put that database together, and it took 5 years to compile it all together. The important part about that to understand is the reason why the Native Women's Association of Canada put a database together is because the RCMP and other policing groups are not required, they're not mandated to track the Aboriginal identity of victims. Instead, they're required to track Aboriginal identity of offenders, which is why we see such high numbers of Aboriginal women and men incarcerated level, these kind of issues. But they're not required to track that Aboriginal identity as a victim. But the whole basis of our work is saying that Aboriginal women are being targeted.
Right. Yes.
So we had to put that database together for our own, and it's based on confirmed cases that we know. So right now, as of March 31st, 2010, we had 582 cases. So that's 582 mothers and sisters and daughters and aunties and grandmothers who were in the database. Families who came to us and gifted us with the story, as well as confirmed cases, either that were confirmed by a community or the media or the police.
Okay. Are you? You did mention that Sisters in Spirit ran for 5 years. Are you able to tell us anything about the funding issue between the federal government and Sisters in Spirit?
Well, what I can tell you is that everyone, we all knew that it was a 5-year initiative from 2005 to 2010. And when the program sunset in 2010, we moved right away into another initiative called Evidence to Action. And that really, Evidence to Action was designed to move the issue from the research phase into the action phase. And so we did receive funding to do that and to move forward. There was, unfortunately, as we moved from Evidence to Action 1 into Evidence to Action 2, we did suffer a funding gap in that sense. But now we're here, we have a staff back, we're moving forward, we have the UN inquiry, we have amazing partners, new partners as well as our long-standing ones, and we're just moving forward on the issue, trying to let people know that yes, the Sisters in Spirit initiative has sunset, but the work still remains very much strong and alive, and we're still working with families and carrying those voices through to all levels of government, really.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Jorge, this week on blackcoffeepoet.com, we talked a little bit about your blog, and I think we at Indigenous Waves are pretty familiar with your blog. This week on Black Coffee Poet, it's Honoring and Remembering Indigenous Women Week. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that entails on your blog?
Yes, and hi Jennifer, nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
And well, this week what we're doing is because tomorrow is February 14th, which is the day to honor and remember Aboriginal women who have gone missing or have been murdered. I wanted to take a little bit of a different approach this year, but similar. Whereas last year I called it Breaking the Silence about Canada's 800 plus missing or murdered Aboriginal women. This year it's about highlighting that, obviously. It's something important that we all have to know about, remember, and take action. But it's also about remembering the women that are here and fighting. So that's why I wanted to call it Honoring and Remembering. And I consulted some of my, my mentors who are Indigenous women and are much older than myself. And I said, this is what I'm thinking of doing, and calling it a different name. And they were like, you know what, we like that, Honoring and Remembering. And so what's happening this year, a little bit similar to last year, I did a video interview last year with Eden Robinson where we talked about the numbers, the women, the problem in BC. Although this Oh, and I want to point out this is not just a BC problem. People always think, oh yeah, British Columbia, Vancouver, that's where it happens, but it's all across the country.
Absolutely.
And we could say all across the Western Hemisphere. Indigenous women are under attack in the many different countries that make up the Americas. But we're focusing on Turtle Island, the land now known as Canada, today and on this week. Anyways, and so what I did was I interviewed a grandmother in the community. Many call her an elder, but she herself says, I'm not an elder, I'm a grandmother, Wanda Whitebird. And so I video interviewed her, and that was done at the Toronto Rape Crisis Center, who I work with, and they're generous enough to give me a space that I can use to do these interviews that I've done in the past and I'm going to continue to do in the future. And with Wanda, we talked about violence via different forms: policy, physical, silence as violence, and everything that has led up to the present day, and how basically Aboriginal women can go missing and be murdered, and the government doesn't care, and the police don't do anything. You know, so she talked about the Indian Act. She talked about people who don't have status and want to return to their communities and aren't accepted. She talked about skin privilege and everything that has led up to today. And we talked about incarceration. And then under that review, under that video, is the review that you did, Susan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
An old feminist journal called Fireweed, which lost their funding once they started getting really political in the early 2000s. So shame on the funders. And, you know, it was a feminist journal, and it was written and put together in 1986. It was edited by all Native women, and it was written by all Native women. So it's called Fireweed number 22, Native Women. And when I saw this book, I was like, this is the book that I would like reviewed for this week. And then I asked you as a Native woman to please review it, and you accepted, and you did an amazing job. So all of you, check out blackcoffeepoet.com and check out Susan Blight's writing, her thoughts on this book, and you learn a little bit more about Susan. And then the rest of the week, on Wednesday, there's an interview with Bridget-Tolley, and she is part of Families of Sisters in Spirit. So they are a group that came out of Sisters in Spirit. When Sisters in Spirit lost their funding, they decided, okay, we're not going to stop our work, we're going to do Families of Sisters in Spirit. And I'm not going to talk too much about that interview, but Bridget-Tolley does the work she does. Well, she calls it her life, she doesn't call it work, she said in the interview, because her mother was killed by a Quebec police officer. And so, you know, going through that process of losing your mother and then trying to find out what happened, and of course the cops are covering everything up, it was a very dirty scenario where the lead investigator of the case was the brother of the cop who killed her mother. That's just ridiculous. And she had to pay for a police report, and it took a year and a half. So she's in this struggle for life, and not just about her mother, it's about all the missing and murdered Aboriginal women, and the women who haven't gone missing or been murdered, just to keep them safe, you know what I mean? Keep a strong nation going, or nations, I should say. And so when I heard that, you know, it was about her mother, and I'm crazy about my mother, and I'm blessed that I have 4 mothers, and so I said, this is the person I'd like to interview. And in that interview is a key question. I'm not going to talk too much about the interview, just I asked her, you're not being funded, and you've actually been given a space right now for free for the moment. You know, how are you going to continue to survive? And I said, are you accepting donations? And then she gave that info. Yes, Families of Sisters in Spirit are accepting donations, and she gave the info of how you can donate to this organization, which is doing a lot of good work. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, check out the interview for like everything she has to say, but that's a key thing, you know, to help out people and keep this movement going. And then on the Friday, there's poetry by the producer of Indigenous Waves, Jamaias DaCosta, who spoke in the language as well as English, and in her poem, which is a beautiful poem. Janet Marie Rogers, who's a very well-known Mohawk poet who's now over in BC with a radio show and coming out with new books and videos all the time. And I managed to videotape Dallas Goldtooth of the famous troupe, the 1491s, who are down from the land now known as America. And he's DaCosta, and he wrote a poem to his mother, and I taped him, and it's a beautiful poem. So that's the week. Today it's already up. You've got the video with Wanda Whitebird, which touches on so many things. You've got the review of Fireweed 22 Native Women by Susan Blight. And then you've got Wednesday, there'll be an interview with a photo essay. I'm going to the rally tomorrow, and I'm going to take a ton of photos. There'll be a photo essay in between the text of Bridget-Tolley's interview. And then on the Friday, there will be poems by Jamaias, Susan, and Dallas.
Excellent. Well, we'll definitely give the information before the end of the show on the rally that's taking place tomorrow in Toronto, and
Yes.
I know that they're taking place all across Turtle Island.
I think there's
tomorrow.
maybe 80 across Turtle Island.
Yes.
The movement has grown, and we hope it continues to grow.
Absolutely. So, Jorge, why is it important to do this kind of work on your blog in terms of these thematic weeks, and particularly in terms of the missing and murdered Aboriginal women?
Well, it's something that not a lot of people know about. The mainstream media doesn't cover it enough, if at all, and if they do, they don't cover it well. There's always a stigma. They always talk about these women as being sex workers or drug addicts or all that. And there's all kinds of women that are missing and murdered, and it doesn't matter, if they were a sex worker or an addict. These are people, these are women, they're original to this land. And so me as a journalist, as a poet, as an essayist, I try to do things much different than the mainstream. I try to show a different side to each story, and I try to get the people to talk to themselves. So, for example, when I interviewed Wanda Whitebird, it's not like something you'd see on the CBC Hard Talk where we sat across from each other and I'm hammering her with tough questions, We met up at the Toronto Rape Crisis Centre, we talked, and I was like, what do you, as an Aboriginal woman who's been involved with the rally every year since the beginning, what do you want people to know? What do you want viewers of blackcoffeepoet.com to know? And then we had a blackboard and I wrote things down, and then I came up with some questions, and then we sat down, and then we taped.
Yeah.
So it's her voice,
Yeah.
which is one voice of many in the Aboriginal community. But at least it's not some right-wing journalist who's gonna, slam, people and stigmatize people and be very racist.
Yeah, well, that's been part of the problem, I think, thus far. And you mentioned mainstream media and I guess their lack of attention on this issue. I'm wondering, Jennifer, the BC Missing Women's Commission of Inquiry has been pretty universally, I would say, described as a failure or a sham. Do you have a sense of why that is? What exactly went wrong with that inquiry?
I think for the most part, as you know, like Native Women Association, and we're not part of it. So I think that's part of the criticism too, that we're not supposed to be commenting on it because we're not actually in there, in the doors, participating in it. But we actually couldn't participate because we couldn't afford lawyers to bring there. We couldn't afford the travel to go down there. We also really encouraged several family members that we knew. We know dozens and dozens across the country who could participate in this, especially families we know in BC, and they didn't have the opportunity to come forward and participate either. And I think that really speaks to the inclusive process. We wanted it to be inclusive, and I think at the beginning it was painted as such, but as it came down, NWAC was one of the only organizations to be granted status to come in, but we chose not to participate because it was not a fair and inclusive process. And I think that's really important that, we wanted to stand in solidarity with all the other families as well as all the other grassroots organizations that had been doing work on the ground in Vancouver and in BC for all this time, and we didn't want that to be taken away by a national organization. So we're still working with partners, we're putting together press releases. We definitely are monitoring the situation, and we're working, coming up with kind of a lessons learned document on what's going on here. But I think that's one of the reasons why it's received so much criticism, is because it's not an inclusive process. And if you're not going to hear actually from Aboriginal women themselves, then we can't really move forward on this. And it's the same thing with the UN inquiry that we're talking about right now too.
Absolutely. So I know that the Native Women's Association of Canada, as well as other grassroots organizations, have been working for over 20 years in this kind of work. Do you have a sense of why the federal government has not acted on this issue? In spite of the fact of the hundreds of women that have gone missing or have been found murdered, why they were never acting on this issue before?
I think Jorge has really touched upon it when he's talking about the media and how we see these kind of issues. For myself, as a Métis woman, I have roots in Lac St. Anne, which is just outside of Edmonton, and I don't remember growing up ever hearing about these types of issues. Now, if you were in your own community, you were aware of these type of issues, but you certainly didn't have these kind of labels like missing and murdered Aboriginal women or human rights or national tragedy or these kind of words. This is just kind of a reality that you live with. And as I've grown and I've gone to school and then coming to work for a national organization, I see the real scope of this. And I see how, as Jorge also pointed out, that it's not just a BC issue, it's not a West Coast issue. Our research really shows that this impacts First Nation, Métis, and Inuit women equally, It touches every province and territory that we have in Canada and also on Turtle Island, everywhere. We're all touched by this. It happens in urban centers. It happens in rural areas as well. And it just really speaks to the devaluing of Aboriginal women in our society. But I think what Jorge really talked about was how the media portrays this. And I think it's a reflection of our society that we don't value Aboriginal women. They're seen as Native women only, not as someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone that you cared about. Imagine if that happened to you. No, it's seen as sex worker or prostitute or troubled teen or runaway. And these kind of labels really desensitize us, I think, in this society, so that we're already blaming the victim. And I think that's really where we go with this. That it's not really about, oh, how tragic this is. We need to rally support and work on prevention. It's about what these people put themselves in these situations. Yeah. And really the situation, though, is a direct result of colonization.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Jorge actually just shared something with me. Did you want to talk about that, Jorge?
Oh yeah, I totally agree with what Jen said. But first I'd like to say that I love how Jennifer just mentioned there's so many groups, and you did as well, Susan. You know, there's a couple of us on the radio right now, but there's a lot of unseen people. You know, and for example, even the feast that's happening tomorrow after the rally, people cooked. People booked a room. People are going to be handing out strawberries and water at the rally. People worked for months to put that rally together, you know, and then you have so many groups happening in Toronto. I believe it's No More Silence and a lot of people. So we got to thank and acknowledge those people for sure, because there's a ton of people doing work and unsung heroes in this movement.
Absolutely.
And another thing I'd like to point out is last year I highlighted a very famous case, Helen-Betty-Osborne. But what I think is being left out also is our transgendered sisters. And a lot of people know about Helen-Betty-Osborne. They don't know that her sister, a transgendered woman, Rose Osborne, was also murdered. So we only talk about Helen-Betty-Osborne, but you know, her transgendered sister as well was murdered. And trans women are under attack, and they are at the highest levels of being under attack on the street. Mm-hmm. And so we have to remember that, you know, it's not just cisgendered women who are going missing. We have transgendered women, two-spirit women, queer native women who are not two-spirit. All kinds of different women from different genders and sexualities who are Aboriginal are missing and being murdered.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jennifer, you mentioned the UN inquiry. What can you tell us about the UN inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women?
Well, the UN, I mean, it's really in this kind of far-off place. Like, what's the United Nations and what do they do? And basically, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which is CEDAW, CEDAW, they've been in dialogue with Canada as a nation since 2008, specifically on this issue. And it's about CEDAW as a committee, members of other nations putting together a report asking Canada, what are you doing for this issue? You know, we have other organizations, such as Native Women's Association of Canada, other grassroots organizations coming forward, really sending our information to the UN to say, nothing is being done in Canada. We need your help to raise awareness. We need you to hold the Canadian government accountable, because we have been trying to do that unsuccessfully for the past 20 years. And what the committee has finally announced is that they are going to be holding their own inquiry in Canada on this issue of missing murdered Aboriginal women and girls, because the Canadian government has failed to respond to their questions. They keep on saying they have these reports. They keep on saying that they need this outcomes and measurements report, and they haven't received it. Mm-hmm. So they called for an inquiry, and the Native Women's Association of Canada, as well with over 100 different organizations across Canada, has released another press release calling on the CEDAW committee to make sure that they have actual hearings and a site visit to Canada, so that Aboriginal women and girls and their families and communities and the organizations that work on behalf of them, all of them, or more than 100 strong in Canada, can come forward and bring forward our voice and finally demand action and move forward on this issue, because I think you can really see to the strength. And as Jorge was saying too, so many of us are working together, and the Native Women's Association in Canada has never said that we're the ones moving this movement. This movement has always been very strong from the grassroots, from the community level, because it's the communities, it's us individuals who have been experiencing this trauma and have been working through these activist justice issues. We live it on our daily lives, and we just had someone like Native Women Association of Canada and the other larger organizations, just helping to encourage and support all of these other organizations.
Well, I'd like to take this moment, Jennifer, to thank you for being on the show. We really appreciate it. I think you're doing very good work with the Native Women's Association of Canada, and we'll keep watching this story, and thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. Jorge, it was nice to meet you.
You too as well.
So Jorge, I believe you do have a poem that's going to close us out till the break. Would you like to share your poem?
Yes, I wrote this poem when looking through the newspaper and seeing women after women being murdered in the same issue, and remembering when our former mayor David Miller walked up and down Yonge Street when a white woman was killed, but he's never done it for anyone else. So I wrote this poem, sent it into the Toronto Star, and it was published 2 days later. It was August 13th, 2008. A poem to Mayor David Miller. Why haven't you walked the streets of Parkdale or rallied around the Sherbourne Street high-rises to end violence against women, the way you marched up and down Yonge Street a few years back? I guess a brown, chubby-cheeked First Nations girl and a woman struggling with addiction don't count. They weren't blonde, blue-eyed, and middle-class. They weren't from the #1 area to own property in 2008. They weren't the picture of Canada. Caitlin Sampson was of color, original to this land, and the worst case Detective Ryan has seen in 20 years on the job. Carolyn Connolly was middle-aged, battled cocaine for a third of her life, left dead in an alley, something that no one should go through. They might just be numbers to you, murders 38 and 39. They're not numbers to their families, their friends, their communities, to me.
From the roots up. CIUT 89.5 FM, broadcasting live